At first glance, Joseph and Kendra Duggar's marriage looked like one of the simplest, happiest stories in the entire Duggar world. Quiet, drama-free, almost untouched by the chaos that seemed to follow others in the family. But when you start lining up the timeline of their relationship with everything that was happening behind the scenes, a different picture begins to take shape. And this is where things start to get strange, because the calm, polished image people saw on the surface doesn't fully match what was unfolding in the background. Because while Joseph Duggar and Kendra Duggar were building what looked like a picture-perfect life, fast engagement, early marriage, and a growing family, there were already tensions quietly forming within the larger Duggar circle. And the timing of it all is what raises eyebrows, because their relationship progressed rapidly during a period when the family was already dealing with increasing scrutiny, shifting public perception, and pressure that most viewers never fully saw. It felt almost like their story was being positioned as a kind of reset, a return to the ideal image. But that's not even the most interesting part, because when you look closely at how their marriage was presented compared to what was actually happening in the Duggar world at the time, there's a noticeable gap. On camera, everything seemed effortless. Kendra's cheerful personality, Joseph's quiet demeanor, the constant emphasis on simplicity and happiness. But off camera, the family was navigating controversies, internal strain, and decisions that would later have serious consequences. And somehow their relationship remained untouched by all of it. Or at least, that's how it appeared. And that raises a question that most people didn't think to ask back then. Was their marriage really as separate from the chaos as it seemed? Or was it playing a much bigger role in maintaining the family's image during a critical time? Because the more you dig into the timeline, the more it starts to feel like their relationship wasn't just happening alongside these events. It was unfolding right in the middle of them, almost like a carefully timed narrative that kept attention focused elsewhere. But here's where the tension really starts to build, because once you stop looking at their marriage as just a love story and start viewing it within the context of everything surrounding the Duggar family at that time, certain details begin to stand out in a way they didn't before. Small things, subtle shifts, moments that didn't seem important at the time but start to feel different when you revisit them now. And once you notice those details, it becomes harder to ignore the possibility that there was more going on beneath the surface, something that didn't fully come into focus until much later. When you start connecting those details, the story begins to feel a lot less straightforward, because the timing of Joseph and Kendra's relationship doesn't just overlap with major moments in the Duggar timeline, it seems to move alongside them in a way that's hard to ignore. Their courtship became public, their engagement happened quickly, and their wedding followed not long after, all during a period when the family was still trying to stabilize its image and maintain a sense of normalcy. And on the surface, it worked. Viewers were given a storyline that felt light, hopeful, and uncomplicated, something that stood in sharp contrast to the heavier issues that had already started surrounding the family name. But this is where things start to feel less like coincidence, because the more you line up those events, the more it seems like their relationship was consistently highlighted at moments when the family needed a positive narrative the most. And it wasn't just the timing, it was the tone. Every appearance, every interaction, every milestone in their relationship seemed to reinforce a very specific image: young, devoted, and completely aligned with the values the Duggar family had always promoted. Joseph Duggar was portrayed as steady and dependable, while Kendra Duggar brought an almost constant sense of optimism and cheerfulness that made their dynamic feel refreshingly simple. But when people started revisiting those moments later, some began to notice how consistent that portrayal was, almost too consistent. There were very few signs of conflict, hesitation, or adjustment, which is unusual for any relationship, especially one moving at that pace and under that level of public attention. And that's where another layer of the pattern begins to show, because their story didn't just exist on its own, it fit perfectly into what the family needed at the time. While other narratives were becoming more complicated and harder to manage, Joseph and Kendra's relationship provided something stable and predictable, something that could be relied on to bring the focus back to familiar themes of faith, family, and commitment. People have pointed out that this kind of contrast can be incredibly powerful, especially in a reality TV setting, where what gets emphasized often shapes how the audience understands everything else. And when one storyline feels overwhelmingly positive, it can subtly shift attention away from anything that doesn't fit that same tone. But that's not even where it gets most interesting, because as their marriage progressed, the same pattern didn't fade, it continued. Major life updates, growing their family, and maintaining that same consistent image all happened while the broader Duggar situation continued evolving in the background. And again, it's not about any single moment standing out. It's about how all of those moments taken together seem to follow a rhythm that aligns a little too closely with what was happening around them. Which raises another question that people didn't fully explore at the time. Was their relationship simply unaffected by everything else? Or was it quietly being positioned in a way that helped balance the narrative when things elsewhere became more difficult to explain? And once you start asking that question, it becomes harder to look at their marriage as completely separate from the larger picture, because every new detail starts to feel connected to something bigger that was unfolding at the same time. To really understand why their marriage seemed to follow that same rhythm so consistently, you have to step back and look at the environment both Joseph Duggar and Kendra Duggar came from, because their relationship didn't develop in isolation. It was shaped by a very specific set of expectations long before it ever became public. Within the Duggar world, and the circles closely connected to it, relationships aren't just personal decisions. They're guided, structured, and often accelerated in ways that reflect deeply held beliefs about family, faith, and roles within a marriage. Courtships are intentional, timelines are shorter, and the idea of presenting a unified, positive image isn't just encouraged, it's expected. And once you understand that, the consistency in how their relationship was presented starts to feel less surprising and more like the natural outcome of a system that prioritizes stability and alignment above everything else. What makes this even more revealing is how that system doesn't just influence the couple, it influences how their story is shared with the outside world. In a setting where reputation and values are closely tied together, there's a strong incentive to highlight what reinforces those ideals while minimizing anything that doesn't. That doesn't necessarily mean anything was hidden in a dramatic sense, but it does suggest that what people saw was carefully framed to fit a certain narrative. And when a couple like Joseph and Kendra fits that narrative so perfectly, young, cheerful, seemingly effortless, it creates a kind of feedback loop where that image is continually reinforced both by the family and by the way their story is presented publicly. But that's not even the most important part, because once that image is established, it can start to serve a purpose beyond just telling their story. And this is where the deeper layer begins to come into focus. Because if a relationship embodies everything the system values, obedience, harmony, growth, it can become more than just a personal milestone. It can function as a kind of reassurance that the system itself is still working exactly as intended. People have pointed out that in environments like this, certain relationships end up carrying more symbolic weight than others, especially during times when the broader image is under pressure. And when you place Joseph and Kendra's marriage into that context, it starts to feel less like a completely separate storyline and more like a reflection of the same structure that shaped everything else happening around them. But here's where the tension really deepens, because systems like this don't just influence how things look, they influence how people within them interpret what's happening. If the framework emphasizes positivity, unity, and moving forward, then even during moments of external controversy, there can be a tendency to focus on what reinforces stability rather than what disrupts it. And that doesn't mean every decision is calculated or intentional, but it does mean the outcomes often follow a similar pattern. Which brings everything back to the same underlying idea. If their marriage felt consistently untouched by the surrounding chaos, it might not be because it existed outside of it, but because it was shaped by the same forces that were guiding how everything else was being handled. And once you start to see it that way, it becomes harder to separate their story from the larger system entirely, because the very qualities that made their relationship seem so simple on the surface may actually be the same qualities that connected it to something much more complex underneath. And this is where the timeline starts to feel a lot heavier, because as everything escalated in the Duggar world, especially leading up to and following the legal situation involving Josh Duggar, the contrast between what was happening publicly and how Joseph and Kendra's life appeared became impossible to ignore. According to reports and public coverage at the time, the family was facing some of its most serious scrutiny yet, with details emerging that shifted the conversation from past controversies into something far more severe. And in moments like that, people usually expect to see a clear ripple effect across everyone connected to the situation. But here's where things take an unexpected turn, because while the pressure intensified, Joseph and Kendra's public image remained almost completely unchanged. People have pointed out that during key moments, court appearances, media coverage, and the period when everything was being discussed at its peak, There was very little visible shift in how their relationship was presented or perceived. There weren't dramatic public statements. There wasn't a noticeable pivot in how they engaged with the situation, and instead, what continued to surface were updates that aligned with the same consistent tone they had always maintained. Allegedly, this kind of response wasn't unique to them alone, but what made it stand out in their case was how closely it matched the pattern that had already been forming long before things reached this level. It wasn't just silence or distance, it was continuity. And that continuity is what raises the stakes, because when a situation becomes this serious, maintaining the same outward image can start to feel like a deliberate choice rather than a natural one. According to observers who followed the timeline closely, there were moments when even subtle acknowledgement could have shifted how their role in the broader story was perceived, but those moments passed without much visible change. And again, that doesn't automatically mean intention, but it does reinforce the idea that their response, whether active or passive, fit into the same structure that had guided everything up to that point. But that's not even where the tension peaks, because when you combine this phase with everything that came before, the rapid courtship, the perfectly aligned public image, the timing of major life events, it starts to form a pattern that feels too consistent to ignore. People have suggested that in situations like this, maintaining normalcy can serve a purpose, especially when the surrounding narrative becomes difficult to control. And if that's the case, then their marriage wasn't just happening alongside these events. It was continuing to reflect a version of stability at a time when stability was becoming harder to find. And once you reach that point, the question shifts again, because it's no longer just about what they did or didn't say during the most serious moments. It's about why the same pattern held firm even under that level of pressure, when breaking away would have been the clearest signal of change. And when you put all of this together, the timing, the consistency, the way every phase of their relationship seemed to align with something bigger happening in the background, it stops feeling like a coincidence and starts to look like a pattern that was always there, just not immediately obvious. Because the truth is, Joseph and Kendra's marriage didn't need to change in order to respond to what was happening around them. It was already built in a way that allowed it to stay the same. And that's the part that most people didn't fully realize at the time, because from the outside, consistency looks like stability. But within a certain kind of system, consistency can also mean something else entirely. It can mean that the response was predetermined by the environment itself. At its core, what you're really seeing isn't just a relationship playing out naturally, it's a relationship unfolding within a structure that rewards predictability, unity, and a very specific kind of public image. And once that structure is in place, it doesn't require constant adjustment to handle new situations, because the framework already dictates how those situations will be approached. That's why the same tone carried through every stage, why the same sense of calm never seemed to break, and why even during the most serious moments, the outward narrative remained almost unchanged. People have pointed out that in environments like this, the appearance of normalcy can be one of the most powerful tools, because it reassures both insiders and outsiders that the system is still functioning exactly as it should. But what makes this especially significant is how it connects back to the question that was there from the very beginning. Was their marriage really separate from everything else, or was it quietly reinforcing the same system that shaped the entire Duggar story? Because once you look at it through that lens, every detail starts to line up in a way that feels intentional, even if it wasn't consciously planned at every step. The rapid timeline, the consistent portrayal, the lack of visible disruption during major events, all of it points back to the same underlying dynamic that kept repeating itself, not just in their story, but across the broader environment they were part of. And in the end, that's what makes this pattern so difficult to ignore, because it isn't about one moment or one decision. It's about a continuous alignment between a relationship and the system surrounding it, one that held steady even when everything else was shifting. And once you see that, it changes how you interpret everything that came before, because the calm, picture-perfect image wasn't just a contrast to the chaos. It may have been part of how that chaos was managed all along. And maybe the most unsettling realization is this: sometimes the stories that seem the most normal on the surface are the ones that reveal the most when you start asking why they never changed.